All right, so today we're going deep on a topic that's heavy, no doubt, but super important. Bombings and blasts throughout history. We've got a whole stack of sources here detailing some of the deadliest events. But our mission today is to understand these tragedies not just as statistics, but like real turning points in history.
Definitely.
We want to examine the context, the ripple effects, and hopefully uncover some insights
Uh-huh.
that might help prevent such events in the future.
I think that's key. It's fascinating how these sources, while they do focus on the immediate aftermath, the casualty numbers,
Mm-hmm.
they often miss the long-term consequences.
Oh, yeah.
The political shifts, the cultural scars, like the erosion of trust. These things linger long after the dust settles.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. And I think that's where our deep dive comes in. We'll try to connect those dots, explore the nuances,
Yeah,
add that extra layer of meaning to these events.
right.
So let's start with two events that even decades later continue to haunt us.
Yeah.
Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Over 200,000 people died, and the long-term impact of radiation exposure continues to this day.
Right.
I remember learning about this in school,
Yeah.
but what really struck me while reading these sources was just the sheer scale of the destruction, like the way these bombs just instantly reshaped the landscape and the lives of those who survived.
And what's particularly striking about Hiroshima and Nagasaki is they weren't just about ending World War II.
Right.
I mean, these bombings ushered in the nuclear age,
Yeah.
a period of existential anxiety that continues to shape, I think, global politics and military strategy. Like, it's a stark reminder
Yeah.
of the immense destructive power that humanity now possesses
Right.
and the ethical dilemmas
Yeah.
that come with it.
Yeah, it's almost impossible to wrap your head around the magnitude of it all.
Yeah.
And then shifting gears to another event from World War II,
Okay.
we have the bombing of Dresden, Germany.
Mm-hmm.
This event, as our sources point out, is still shrouded in controversy.
Right.
Some argue it was necessary military target, while others believe it was an act of disproportionate violence
Yeah.
against a civilian population.
Sure.
Regardless of which side you fall on, though,
Mm-hmm.
the massive loss of life, estimated between 25,000 and 35,000, is undeniable.
No,
Yeah.
what makes Dresden so compelling from a historical perspective is that it forces us to grapple with these really difficult questions surrounding wartime decisions and the unintended consequences of those actions.
Oh, yeah.
It also highlights the just devastating impact that conventional bombs, even without the added horror of nuclear fallout, can have on a city and its people.
Right.
Yeah.
It's a sobering reminder that war, in all its forms, ultimately targets human lives. And speaking of targets, let's move on to acts of terrorism. Events specifically designed to inflict fear and disrupt societies.
Yeah, and I think one of the key insights I glean from these sources is the importance of understanding the motivations and goals behind these attacks.
Mm-hmm.
As difficult as that may be,
Sure.
take the Beirut barracks bombing in 1983. This attack, which killed over 300 American and French service members,
Yeah.
was a major turning point in the Lebanese Civil War.
Yeah.
What makes this event particularly significant, I think, is that it marked the emergence of Hezbollah
Mm-hmm.
as a major force in the region, a force that continues to shape Middle Eastern politics to this day.
And what about the type of explosives used in this attack?
Okay.
Was there anything in the sources about the scale of the blast?
Sure.
Or the specific security failures that allowed it to happen?
Well, the sources mentioned that 2 truck bombs were used,
Oh,
each carrying the equivalent of several thousand pounds of TNT.
gosh.
This resulted in an enormous explosion that collapsed the 4-story barracks building,
Wow.
trapping many victims under the rubble. While the sources don't go into detail about specific security failures, they do highlight the general lack of preparedness
Right. Yeah.
for such a large-scale attack at the time.
Yeah.
This event, along with other attacks in the region, led to significant changes in security protocols for U.S. military installations overseas.
So it seems like the perpetrators in Beirut weren't just trying to kill, they were trying to send a message, to make a statement on a global stage.
Precisely. And that pattern continued with the 1993 World Trade Center bombing,
Right.
a chilling foreshadowing of the 9/11 attacks.
Mm-hmm.
This attack exposed the vulnerability of seemingly impenetrable structures and the potential for terrorists to strike at the heart of American economic power.
That's a really important point. It's easy to get caught up in the statistics, but remembering the human stories is crucial. And I think that's what we're trying to do here. And of course, we can't talk about terrorism without acknowledging the world-changing event of September 11, 2001.
The 9/11 attacks were a watershed moment
Hmm.
not only for the United States,
Right.
but for the entire world. They ushered in an era of heightened security,
Hmm.
increased surveillance, and a profound sense of vulnerability that continues to shape our lives today.
It's almost as if the world entered a new chapter on that day, a chapter defined by fear, uncertainty, and a global fight against terrorism. But even before 9/11, there were attacks that shook us to the core, attacks that demonstrated the global reach of terrorism and its ability to strike anywhere, anytime.
Absolutely. The Madrid train bombings in 2004
Right.
and the London bombings in 2005 are prime examples.
Yeah.
These attacks targeted everyday commuters,
Yeah.
causing widespread fear and disruption.
Right.
They exposed the vulnerability of mass transit systems
Mm-hmm.
and the psychological impact of terrorism, demonstrating how these acts are designed not only to kill, but to sow fear
Mm-hmm.
and disrupt the fabric of daily life.
Yeah, it's like they're trying to break our collective spirit to make us afraid to trust each other, to go about our lives.
In a way, yes. Terrorism often seeks to exploit our very interconnectedness, turning the systems and spaces we rely on, our transportation networks, our public gatherings, our shared sense of normalcy, into sources of fear and vulnerability.
And these sources also highlight the Manchester Arena bombing in 2017, another horrific example of terrorism targeting innocent lives,
Right.
attacking a concert full of young people. It's just heartbreaking.
The Manchester Arena bombing was a stark reminder of the callous nature of these attacks, the deliberate targeting of innocent lives,
Hmm.
to maximize fear and impact.
Yeah.
It also underscored the evolving tactics of terrorist organizations, their ability to adapt and strike at soft targets with devastating consequences.
And while we often focus on these large-scale events, it's important to remember that every bombing, every blast represents individual tragedies,
Yeah,
shattered lives and communities forever altered.
absolutely. It's easy to become numb to the statistics, but we must never lose sight of the human cost. Each of these attacks represents countless stories of pain, loss, and resilience. It's important to honor those stories and to remember that behind every headline,
Right.
there are real people whose lives have been irrevocably changed.
It's a lot to process, to be honest. And while these global acts of terrorism are terrifying, our sources also delve into tragedies that hit closer to home, specifically acts of domestic terrorism. The Oklahoma City bombing in 1995, perpetrated by Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols, really shocked America to its core.
Yeah, what's particularly disturbing about the Oklahoma City bombing is that it revealed this dark undercurrent of extremism within the United States, fueled by anti-government sentiment and conspiracy theories.
Yeah.
It shattered this illusion of safety and brought the threat of terrorism right to our doorstep.
It's a stark reminder that the threat of violence can come from within, from individuals or groups who feel alienated or disenfranchised. And this attack also targeted a federal building, a symbol of government authority. What was the intended message behind that, do you think?
Well, the bombing of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building was a direct assault on the institutions of American democracy, I'd say.
Yeah.
McVeigh and Nichols saw the federal government as tyrannical and oppressive, and their attack was intended to strike a blow against what they perceived as, an illegitimate authority.
It's a chilling example of how extremist ideologies, even those rooted in domestic grievances, can lead to horrific acts of violence. And then just a few years ago, we had the Boston Marathon bombing, another act of domestic terrorism that left a scar on one of America's most cherished events.
Yeah, the Boston Marathon bombing, carried out by the Tsarnaev brothers, demonstrated the evolving nature of domestic terrorism. They were motivated by this mixture of radical Islamic beliefs and personal grievances, highlighting these complex and often intertwined factors that can drive individuals to violence.
It seems like these attacks, whether driven by global ideologies or domestic grievances, share a common thread, a desire to inflict fear and disrupt the fabric of society. But what about acts of violence that aren't intentional? Those that stem from negligence or human error?
Sure.
The Bhopal gas disaster in 1984 is a prime example, and it's something I wasn't very familiar with before reading these sources.
Oh, the Bhopal gas disaster is a tragic case study in the devastating consequences of industrial accidents and corporate negligence. The release of methyl isocyanate gas from a Union Carbide plant in Bhopal, India, killed thousands and left hundreds of thousands with long-term health problems.
The scale of the suffering is just unimaginable. What struck me was the sense of betrayal felt by the people of Bhopal. The realization that their trust in the company responsible for their safety had been so profoundly violated.
Yeah, and the Bhopal disaster raises important questions about corporate responsibility, industrial safety regulations, and the ethical considerations surrounding the development and deployment of potentially hazardous technologies.
Right.
It also highlights the disproportionate impact that such disasters often have on marginalized communities.
It's a sobering reminder that progress, particularly in the realm of technology and industry, must be balanced with a deep commitment to safety, environmental protection, and social justice. And then we have events that are driven by ideologies so extreme they seem to defy comprehension. The Tokyo subway sarin attack in 1995 is a chilling example.
Oh, the Afuim Shinrikyo cult's use of sarin nerve gas in the Tokyo subway was a horrific act of terrorism. That shocked the world. It demonstrated the willingness of some groups to use chemical weapons against innocent civilians and the devastating consequences of such attacks.
What I found particularly disturbing was the cult's belief system, their apocalyptic worldview that justified such acts of violence. Can you tell us a little more about Ephraim Shinrikyo and their motivations?
Sure. Afuim Shinrikyo was a doomsday cult that blended elements of Buddhism, Hinduism, and Christianity, with conspiracy theories and apocalyptic prophecies. They believed that a global war was imminent, and that they were chosen to usher in this new world order through acts of violence and purification.
It's a frightening example of how twisted ideologies can lead to acts of unimaginable cruelty. It also raises questions about the role of mental health, social isolation, and charismatic leadership in the formation and radicalization of such groups.
Yeah, it's important to remember that cults, while often portrayed as monolithic entities, are composed of individuals
Right.
with their own complex motivations and vulnerabilities.
Right.
Understanding the psychological and social factors that contribute to cult membership is crucial for preventing future tragedies.
Okay, shifting gears a bit, our sources also mention the 1947 partition bombings, a tragedy on an almost unimaginable scale that I must admit I didn't know much about before diving into these materials.
The partition of British India into India and Pakistan in 1947 was a tumultuous period marked by widespread violence and displacement.
Right.
The bombings during that time, fueled by religious and ethnic tensions, resulted in a horrific loss of life, with estimates ranging from hundreds of thousands to millions.
The sheer scale of the violence is staggering. Can you provide some more context on the partition itself and the factors that led to such widespread bloodshed?
Well, the partition was this hastily implemented plan to divide British India along religious lines, with Hindu-majority areas becoming India and Muslim-majority areas becoming Pakistan. The drawing of the border was deeply flawed and sparked mass migrations, communal violence, and widespread chaos.
That sounds like a recipe for a disaster.
Yeah,
And the bombings during this period were a particularly brutal manifestation of the hatred and fear that had gripped the region.
the bombings were a symptom of this larger societal breakdown that was occurring. People were terrified, distrustful, and vulnerable to manipulation by extremist groups who exploited religious and ethnic differences to incite violence.
It's a tragic reminder of the human cost of division, of how quickly hatred and fear can escalate into unimaginable brutality. And the legacy of that partition, the lingering tensions and conflicts, continue to shape the region to this day.
The partition of India and Pakistan is a complex and deeply traumatic event that continues to cast a long shadow over South Asia. It's a cautionary tale about the dangers of dividing societies along religious or ethnic lines and the importance of addressing historical grievances and promoting reconciliation.
Speaking of events that might not be as well known but are no less impactful, our sources also touch on the Tbilisi subway explosion in 1996.
The Tbilisi subway explosion, which occurred in the Republic of Georgia, is a reminder that these types of events often occur in the shadow of larger conflicts, fueled by instability and simmering resentment.
Can you elaborate on the context of the Tbilisi attack? I must admit, I'm not very familiar with the geopolitical situation in the Caucasus region.
The Caucasus region, located at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, has a long history of conflict and instability. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 led to a power vacuum and a resurgence of ethnic and territorial disputes.
Right.
The Tbilisi subway explosion was attributed to political motives, with some speculating that it was an act of sabotage intended to destabilize the Georgian government.
So this attack wasn't necessarily an act of terrorism in the traditional sense,
Right.
but rather a manifestation of the broader political turmoil that was gripping the region at the time.
Exactly. It highlights the complex interplay between political violence, crime, and social unrest in post-Soviet states, and the challenges of building stable and democratic societies in such environments.
It's a reminder that these types of attacks don't occur in a vacuum. but are often deeply intertwined with larger political, social, and economic forces. And our sources also include the 1994 AMIA bombing in Argentina, a horrific attack on a Jewish community center that remains unsolved.
The AMIA bombing, which killed 85 people and injured hundreds more, is a tragic example of the enduring threat of anti-Semitism and the global reach of terrorism. The attack remains a source of pain and frustration for the Jewish community in Argentina, and a stark reminder of the importance of combating hatred and intolerance in all its forms.
I was particularly struck by the fact that despite numerous investigations and accusations, no one has ever been brought to justice for this attack.
Yeah, the lack of closure surrounding the AMIA bombing has added another layer of pain and frustration for the victims' families. It also raises questions about the effectiveness of international cooperation in combating terrorism and the challenges of holding perpetrators accountable for their crimes.
It's clear that these bombings and blasts, regardless of their specific causes or contexts, share a common thread: the infliction of immense suffering and the shattering of lives.
Absolutely. And while it's crucial to understand the historical, political, and ideological factors at play, we must never lose sight of the human cost. These aren't just statistics or headlines. They're stories of individual lives cut short, families torn apart, and communities forever scarred.
It's heavy stuff, no doubt. But amidst all this darkness, I'm also struck by the resilience of the human spirit.
Yeah.
We see it in the aftermath of every tragedy.
Yeah.
This incredible capacity for compassion, rebuilding, and moving forward.
That's a really insightful observation, and I think it speaks to the importance of hope, even in the face of unimaginable suffering. It's about acknowledging the pain and loss, while also recognizing the strength and determination that emerge from such experiences.
Yeah, and I think that's what I find so compelling about studying these events. It's not just about dwelling on the darkness, but about understanding the human response, both the destructive and the restorative.
Exactly. And perhaps that's where we can find some glimmers of hope, some insights that might help us prevent such tragedies in the future.
Yeah.
For example, the 2008 Mumbai attacks, which targeted hotels and a railway station, really highlighted the vulnerability of even bustling modern cities to coordinated attacks.
That's right. The Mumbai attacks, orchestrated by Lashkar-e-Taiba, forced security agencies worldwide to rethink their strategies and adapt to a new era of threats. What stands out to me is the sheer audacity of the attacks, the way they targeted multiple locations simultaneously, creating widespread chaos and fear.
Absolutely, and that's a recurring theme in many of the attacks we've discussed, this desire to not just kill but to paralyze, to disrupt the very fabric of daily life.
Yeah. So how do we combat that? How do we protect ourselves without succumbing to fear and paranoia? Where do we go from here?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And there's no easy answer. But I think it starts with recognizing the complex web of factors that contribute to violence, from political and ideological conflicts
Right.
to economic disparities and social injustices.
It feels overwhelming, to be honest. Like, what can one person do in the face of all this? It's easy to feel powerless.
That's where it gets really interesting, because even small acts of compassion, understanding, and bridge building can make a difference.
Okay.
It's about challenging prejudice, promoting dialogue, and supporting initiatives that address the root causes of conflict.
So it's not just about governments and big organizations. It's about all of us taking responsibility.
Exactly. We each have a role to play in creating a more peaceful and just world. It starts with individual choices, with how we interact with each other, how we engage with different perspectives, and how we challenge our own biases.
This deep dive has definitely taken us to some pretty dark places, but I'm walking away feeling not exactly optimistic, but maybe empowered.
Yeah.
Like there's something we can all do to tip the scales, however slightly, towards a better future.
I completely agree. And as we wrap up this exploration, I'd like to leave our listener with a final thought-provoking question. How can we as individuals and as a global community work towards a future where these tragedies are less likely to occur?
That's a powerful question, and one I hope all our listeners will ponder. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. It's been heavy, but also incredibly important, and who knows, maybe it sparks some ideas, some actions that will help us create a world where these kinds of events become less frequent, less devastating. That's the hope anyway.